3 weeks ago, these Americans would have shot him on sight. Now, they were begging him to sit behind them in a cockpit, traveling at speeds that could rip metal apart. The captured German didn't expect mercy. He expected a bullet. Instead, they handed him a flight manual and asked him to keep them alive. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The spring of 1945 brought a strange silence to the German countryside. By late April, the sound of artillery had become so constant that when it finally stopped, soldiers didn't know whether to feel relief or dread. For the men of the 357th Fighter Group, pushing through southern Germany meant expecting resistance at every airfield, every bunker, every crossroad. They had seen too much death to trust silence. Captain James Thornton led a small advance team toward Freiwald Airfield, a location marked on intelligence maps as a Luftwaffe training facility. The road leading to the base was littered with abandoned vehicles. Wehrmacht soldiers had stripped off their uniforms and melted into the forests. White sheets hung from farmhouse windows, yet nobody knew what waited behind the tall pines surrounding the airfield. When they reached the perimeter fence, Thornton raised his fist. The convoy stopped. Engines idled. Men checked their rifles and scanned the tree line. The main gate stood open, swinging slowly in the wind. Beyond it, the runway stretched out like a scar across the landscape, pockmarked with craters from previous bombing raids. They rolled in slowly, weapons ready. The hangars loomed ahead, their steel frames twisted from explosions, roofs partially collapsed. Smoke still drifted from a fuel depot on the eastern edge. But as they approached the main hangar complex, something caught their attention. Through the gaps in the damaged walls, they could see shapes. Aircraft. Not the usual Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. These were different. Thornton stepped out of his jeep and walked toward the largest hangar. His boots crunched on broken glass. Inside, the light was dim, filtering through holes in the roof. And there, lined up in neat rows, were jets. Sleek, silver, predatory-looking machines with swept wings and noses that seemed built for pure speed. Some had damage, others looked almost ready to fly. "Jesus Christ," one of the soldiers whispered. "What the hell are these?" They weren't alone. Movement at the far end of the hangar drew every weapon in the same direction. A group of men in Luftwaffe uniforms stood near a workbench, hands visible, tools scattered at their feet. They weren't armed. They weren't running. They just stood there, waiting. One of them stepped forward. He was tall, lean, with oil stains on his flight suit and exhaustion carved into his face. He couldn't have been older than 30, but his eyes looked like they'd seen a lifetime. He spoke in broken English, carefully choosing each word. "I am pilot. My name is Werner Steiner. We wait for you." Thornton didn't lower his rifle. Neither did anyone else. The last Luftwaffe pilot they'd encountered had tried to detonate a grenade rather than surrender. Trust wasn't something you gave freely. Not anymore. "Hands where I can see 'em," Thornton ordered. "All of you." The Germans complied. Steiner kept his gaze steady, not defiant, just tired. He gestured toward the jets behind him. "These planes, very dangerous. I can help." It was a strange offer. Thornton had expected sullen silence, maybe defiance, perhaps even sabotage. Instead, this German was offering assistance. Was it a trick, a desperate play to avoid a POW camp, or something else entirely? "Why would you help us?" Thornton asked, his voice sharp. Steiner's response was simple. "War is finished. I want to live. You want to understand these." He pointed at the nearest jet. "Without me, you kill yourselves trying." The Americans looked at each other. They had orders to secure any advanced technology and report back. These jets represented something none of them had seen before.
The swept wings alone suggested speeds far beyond anything in the Allied arsenal, but flying them, that was another question entirely. Thornton made a decision. "Sergeant, keep them under guard. Nobody moves without my say-so." He turned to Steiner. "You're going to show us everything, and if you're lying, if this is some kind of setup, you won't live long enough to regret it." Steiner nodded slowly. "I understand." Over the next hours, the Americans began cataloging what they'd found. There were 12 jets in total, in varying states of readiness. Some had engines removed, others lacked fuel, but 3 looked operational. The German mechanics, under Steiner's quiet direction, explained what each aircraft needed. The language barrier was thick. Technical terms didn't translate easily, and hand gestures only went so far. But slowly, through a mixture of broken English, sketches on paper, and patient demonstration, the Germans began to communicate what these machines were. They were HE-162 Volksjägers, people's fighters, jets designed to be mass-produced and flown by pilots with minimal training. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Here was a weapon meant to be simple, yet it was so advanced that the Americans had no idea how to start it, let alone fly it. Thornton watched as Steiner walked along the line of jets, pointing out details. The fuel system was different. The engine required a specific startup sequence. The controls were lighter than any propeller fighter. And the landing, Steiner emphasized with a grim expression, was where most pilots died. "Too fast, you crash. Too slow, engine quits. No choice, no second chance." One of the American pilots, Lieutenant David Park, stepped closer to examine a cockpit. The instruments were labeled in German, the layout unfamiliar. He had flown P-51 Mustangs over France, dodging flak and dueling with Messerschmitts, but this was different. This felt like stepping into the future. "Can we even fly these?" Park asked, not expecting an answer. Steiner heard him. "Yes, but not alone, not first time." The weight of that statement hung in the air. If the Americans wanted to understand these jets, they would need more than manuals and diagrams. They would need someone in the cockpit with them, someone who knew every quirk, every danger. They would need Steiner.
As the day wore on and more personnel arrived, intelligence officers began questioning Steiner in depth. They wanted to know who he was, what he'd done, why he was here. Werner Steiner was not a name on any Allied kill lists. He wasn't an ace. He hadn't shot down dozens of bombers or terrorized formations over Berlin. He was something different, something the Americans hadn't expected. A test pilot. For 2 years, Steiner had worked at experimental airfields across Germany, flying prototypes that were too dangerous or too unproven for regular Luftwaffe squadrons. When engines exploded on takeoff, when wings cracked under stress, when control surfaces locked up at high speed, it was pilots like Steiner who found out the hard way. He explained this calmly, without pride or shame. "I fly so engineers can learn. I test so others can fight." The Americans pressed him. Had he been a Nazi? Steiner's answer was careful. "I was pilot. I did what I was told. I did not ask questions." It was an answer that satisfied no one, but couldn't be easily dismissed. War was complicated. Not every man in a German uniform believed in Hitler's cause. Some had simply been caught in the machinery of a nation at war, doing the jobs assigned to them, because refusing meant death. One thing was clear. Steiner knew these jets better than anyone. He had flown the HE-162 more than 20 times, surviving failures that would have killed less experienced pilots. He knew when the engine would surge, when the controls would stiffen, when the fuel flow would stutter. He had written reports that were ignored by commanders, desperate for any weapon to stop the Allied advance. And now, standing in a captured hangar surrounded by American soldiers, that knowledge was his only currency. Lieutenant Park sat across from Steiner during one of the interrogations. "You know, if you're lying, if something goes wrong up there, it's over for you." Steiner met his gaze. "I know. I want to live. I tell truth." There was something in the way he said it that convinced Park. Not bravery, not arrogance, just a weary honesty. Steiner wasn't trying to be a hero. He was trying to survive. And if survival meant teaching his former enemies how to fly a jet that could kill them, so be it.
By the second day, the Americans had made a decision. A special team was being assembled, engineers and pilots with technical expertise. Their mission? Get these jets airworthy and understand how they worked. The brass wanted answers. The Soviets were advancing from the east, and there were rumors they were grabbing every piece of German technology they could find. The race was on. Steiner and his small crew of mechanics were kept under close watch, but the atmosphere shifted. Rifles were still nearby, but the hostility began to fade, replaced by something stranger: necessity. The Americans needed these Germans, and the Germans, whether they admitted it or not, needed the Americans to see their value. The first attempt to start one of the jets nearly ended in disaster. An American mechanic, eager to prove he understood the fuel system, bypassed a step Steiner had warned about. The engine coughed, belched black smoke, and began screaming at a pitch that sent everyone scrambling. Steiner rushed forward, shouting in German, and hit an emergency shutoff. The engine died with a shuddering whine. Silence. Then Steiner turned to the mechanic, his face pale. "I say, slow. Always slow. You not listen, you die." The mechanic, shaken, nodded. After that, the Americans listened more carefully. Over the next days, a fragile collaboration took shape. Steiner would explain a procedure in halting English. An American engineer would try it, often getting it wrong. Steiner would correct, patiently, sometimes with frustration, but always with precision. Slowly, the language of aviation became a bridge. There were moments of tension. One evening, a soldier muttered loud enough for Steiner to hear, "Why are we helping this bastard? His people killed my friends." Steiner didn't respond. He kept working, tightening a bolt on an engine cowling. But later, Thornton pulled the soldier aside. "I don't like it either, but right now, he's the only reason we're not turning these birds into scrap metal, so keep your feelings to yourself." The soldier nodded, but the bitterness didn't leave his eyes. It was a reminder that cooperation, no matter how necessary, couldn't erase the weight of the war. Still, progress was made. One of the jets was deemed ready for a test. The question now was who would fly it, and whether Steiner's knowledge was enough to keep them alive. Lieutenant Park volunteered. He had the most experience with high-performance fighters, and he wasn't afraid of taking risks. But even he felt the knot in his stomach as he looked at the HE-162 sitting on the cratered runway. Thornton laid it out plainly. "Steiner goes with you. The jet's got a second seat. Barely, but he fits. He talks you through it, step by step. You listen. Understand?" Park nodded. "And if he tries something? Then you put a bullet in him and bring the plane down however you can." It was a brutal calculus, but it was the reality. Trust only went so far. When Park told Steiner the plan, the Germans simply said, "Good, I show you. You learn." As they walked toward the jet together, an American private watched them and shook his head. "Never thought I'd see the day. Us and them, flying together." Another soldier replied quietly, "War's over, maybe, but this is something else." The sun was setting over Freiwald. The shadows grew long across the runway. And two men who weeks ago would have tried to kill each other climbed into the cockpit of a jet designed to win a war that had already been lost. The morning came cold and clear. Park woke before dawn, his stomach tight with a knot that wouldn't loosen. He'd flown combat missions over Germany, dodged flak that could shred a Mustang, fought Focke-Wulfs at altitude where the air was thin enough to make you dizzy. But this was different. This time, he'd be sitting in front of a man who, until days ago, was the enemy. And if something went wrong, if Steiner had lied or missed something, they'd both die together at 500 miles per hour. By the time the sun broke over the pines, mechanics had already fueled the HE-162. Steiner stood beside it, running his hand along the fuselage like a man greeting an old friend. He checked the control surfaces, peered into the air intake, crouched low to inspect the landing gear. Every movement was deliberate, careful. Park watched him and felt a strange reassurance. Whatever else Steiner was, he wasn't careless. Thornton walked over, his face grim. "You don't have to do this, Park. We can wait for more intel, more time." Park shook his head. "If we wait, the Soviets might beat us to understanding these things. Besides, if Steiner wanted us dead, there are easier ways." Thornton didn't look convinced, but he stepped back. "Your call." Park approached Steiner. The German looked up, his expression unreadable. "You are ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be." Steiner nodded. "Good. I sit behind. I tell you everything. You listen, you do exactly what I say. No improvise. Jet does not forgive mistakes." They climbed in. The cockpit was cramped, more so with two men. Park settled into the front seat, his hands hovering over controls labeled in a language he didn't read. Behind him, Steiner's voice came through, calm and steady. "First, fuel mixture. See this lever? Move it to third position." Park did as instructed. The instruments meant nothing to him, just needles and numbers in a foreign script. He was flying blind, trusting a man he had no reason to trust. "Now, throttle, very slow, just touch it. Feel how light it is." Park's hand closed around the throttle. It was feather-light compared to the robust lever of a Mustang. One wrong move and he could blow the engine. "Battery on, then ignition sequence. Wait for my word." The jet began to whine, a high-pitched shriek that grew louder, building into a roar that rattled Park's teeth. The entire aircraft vibrated. On the ground, soldiers covered their ears and backed away. They'd never heard anything like it. "Throttled forward. Slow. Slow." Park eased the throttle. The jet lurched, then steadied. The engine note climbed, settling into a scream that felt alive, predatory. His heart pounded. "Now, brakes off. Let her roll." The HE-162 started down the runway. The acceleration was immediate, brutal. Park's head snapped back. The ground blurred. In seconds, they were going faster than anything he'd flown. The nose lifted almost on its own. "Pull back. Gentle. Not too much." Park pulled. The jet leaped into the air. For a moment, everything was chaos, his instincts screaming at him to do things that didn't apply here. Then Steiner's voice cut through. "Level off. Trim nose down. See the horizon? Keep it there." Park fought the controls, which felt too light, too responsive. Every tiny input translated into movement. But slowly, he found the rhythm. The jet stopped fighting him and started flying. Below, Freewald shrank into a patchwork of green and gray. The speed was intoxicating. Park glanced at the airspeed indicator, trying to make sense of the numbers. They were flying faster than he'd ever gone. "Good," Steiner said. "Now, turn. Very gentle. Jet likes to roll fast. Too much, you spin." Park banked left. The world tilted. For a moment, he felt the edge of control slipping, but he corrected, and the jet obeyed. Behind him, Steiner remained calm, a steady presence. They flew a wide circle around the airfield. Park tested the controls, learning how the jet responded. It was nothing like a propeller fighter. There was no torque, no rumble of a piston engine, just smooth, relentless speed. "Landing is hardest," Steiner said. "You must plan early. Jet does not slow down like you think." Park's palms were sweating inside his gloves. "How early?" 2 miles out. Start descent. Throttle back slow, but not too much. Engine quits if you starve it."
As they lined up for the approach, Park felt the fear return. The runway looked impossibly short. The jet was still moving too fast. "Trust your eyes, not your instincts," Steiner instructed. "Let her glide. She wants to land, just give her space." Park throttled back. The jet didn't decelerate the way he expected. It kept gliding, eating up distance. The runway rushed toward them. Too fast, too fast. "Steady, hold your line." The wheels kissed the ground, once, twice. Then the jet settled, rolling out long and smooth. Park let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. They were down, alive. On the ground, soldiers erupted in shouts. Not cheers exactly, but something close. Disbelief, maybe. Relief. Park taxied back to the hangar, his hands shaking on the controls. When the engine finally wound down, silence fell over the airfield like a blanket. Park climbed out, his legs unsteady. Steiner followed, his face impassive. Thornton walked over, his expression somewhere between awe and anger. "You actually did it!" Park nodded, unable to speak. Steiner simply said, "Jet works. Now others can learn." Word spread quickly. Within days, more pilots arrived at Freiwald, all eager to fly the captured jets. Some were skeptical, others downright hostile toward Steiner and his mechanics. But the fact remained, the HE-162 had flown, and it had flown well. The program expanded rapidly. 3 more jets were made operational. American pilots, under Steiner's watchful instruction, began taking turns in the cockpit. Each flight was a lesson in humility. Men who had aces scores in Mustangs and Thunderbolts found themselves struggling with the finicky, unforgiving nature of jet propulsion. One pilot, Captain Robert Hayes, nearly killed himself on his second flight. He throttled up too quickly during takeoff, and the engine flamed out. The jet dropped like a stone, hitting the runway hard enough to crack the landing gear. Hayes walked away shaken, but alive. Steiner's only comment was, "I told you, slow." Despite the dangers, progress continued. Swastikas were hastily painted over with white stars, a surreal sight that never stopped feeling strange. American markings on German jets, flown by American pilots, trained by German instructors. The war had ended, but its contradictions lingered. Steiner's role evolved. He was no longer just a prisoner with useful knowledge. He became the linchpin of the entire operation. Pilots sought him out before flights, asking questions, requesting advice. Mechanics consulted him when something didn't work as expected. He was indispensable, and everyone knew it. But not everyone was comfortable with it. One evening, a group of soldiers confronted Steiner near the hangar. One of them, a sergeant named Collins, stepped close, his voice low and dangerous. "You know what you people did, right? The camps, the civilians. My cousin died at Bastogne because of you." Steiner met his gaze but said nothing. Collins waited, fists clenched. Finally, Thornton intervened, pulling Collins back. "Enough. He's under my protection. You got a problem. Take it up with me." Collins spat on the ground and walked away. Steiner stood alone, his face unreadable. Later, Park found him sitting on a crate, staring at nothing. "You okay?" Steiner shrugged. "I am alive. That is enough." Park sat beside him. "For what it's worth, I don't think you're responsible for everything that happened." "Does it matter what you think?" Steiner asked quietly. Park didn't have an answer.
By mid-May, orders came down from higher command. The jets needed to be moved to Cherbourg in France, where they would be shipped to the United States for further study. It was a logistical nightmare. The HE-162s were fragile, prone to mechanical failure, and required specific fuel that was in short supply. Flying them across hundreds of miles of war-torn Europe was a gamble. But it was a gamble the Americans were willing to take. A team of pilots, mechanics, and engineers, dubbed Thornton's Raiders by the men, was assembled. Steiner and 2 of his mechanics were included, still under guard, but essential to the mission's success. The first leg of the journey was the shortest, but the most dangerous. The jets had to fly from Freiwald to a captured Luftwaffe base near Stuttgart. The route took them over dense forests and bombed-out towns, areas where the war's devastation was still fresh. Park led the first flight, with Steiner in the rear seat. 2 other jets followed, each flown by American pilots who had trained under Steiner's guidance. The formation climbed into the morning sky, their engines screaming in harmony. Everything went smoothly until they reached the halfway point. One of the trailing jets began to lose power. The pilot, Lieutenant Greg Morton, radioed in panic. "Engines cutting out! I'm losing altitude!" Park watched as the jet dropped behind, trailing smoke. Steiner's voice came through tense. He throttled too much. Engine overheated. Morton managed to glide the jet to a crash landing in a field. The impact was hard, but he walked away with only bruises. The jet, however, was a total loss. It was a harsh reminder of how unforgiving these machines were. The remaining jets continued to Stuttgart, where mechanics worked through the night to prepare them for the next leg. Steiner barely slept, checking and rechecking every system. When Park asked him why he cared so much, Steiner's answer was simple. If plane crashes, you blame me. I want to live. The honesty was brutal, but it was the truth.
Over the next 2 weeks, the small convoy of jets hopscotched across Germany and into France. Each flight was fraught with danger. Weather turned bad over the Rhine, forcing an emergency landing at a makeshift Allied airstrip. Another jet suffered a fuel leak that nearly caused a fire. But each time, Steiner's knowledge kept disaster at bay. The dynamic between the Americans and the Germans shifted during those weeks. Shared danger has a way of eroding walls. Pilots who once refused to speak to Steiner found themselves joking with him over engine troubles. Mechanics who had kept their distance began to appreciate his precision and expertise. One night, camped at an airfield outside Nancy, Park and Steiner sat by a fire, drinking terrible coffee. Around them, men slept or talked in low voices. "Do you regret it?" Park asked. "Flying for them?" Steiner stared into the flames. "I regret many things. But flying? No. Flying is pure. It does not care about politics." "That's a convenient way to look at it." "Perhaps. But it kept me alive. And now it keeps you alive." Park couldn't argue with that. By early June, the convoy reached Cherbourg. The sight of the jets being loaded onto American transport ships was surreal. German aircraft bearing American markings, destined for a country that had fought so hard to defeat them. French dock workers stared in disbelief. Children pointed and whispered. Steiner stood on the dock, watching the jets disappear into the cargo holds. For a moment, his mask slipped. Park saw something in his face. Grief, maybe, or loss. "You okay?" Steiner nodded slowly. "They were beautiful machines. I hope they teach you something." The ships arrived at Norfolk, Virginia in late June. The HE-162s were unloaded and transported to Wright Field in Ohio, where engineers and test pilots waited eagerly. The American aviation community was hungry for knowledge, desperate to understand how the Germans had leapt so far ahead in jet technology. Steiner was brought along, still under guard, but treated with something approaching respect. He was debriefed extensively, his knowledge mined for every detail. American engineers peppered him with questions, and he answered them all with the same weary patience he'd shown at Freiwald. For the pilots who'd flown with him, the separation was strange. Park found himself missing Steiner's calm voice in the rear seat, the steady hand that had kept him alive. Before Steiner was transferred to a debriefing facility, Park sought him out. "I just wanted to say thank you. You didn't have to help us." Steiner shrugged. "I had no choice, but I am glad you lived." They shook hands, two men from opposite sides of a war, bound by shared danger and grudging respect. In the months that followed, the HE-162s were studied exhaustively. Their engines, aerodynamics, and design flaws were documented and analyzed. The lessons learned fed directly into American jet development. Within a few years, aircraft like the F-86 Sabre would dominate the skies, direct descendants of the knowledge captured at Freiwald. Werner Steiner eventually returned to Germany, where he worked quietly in aviation until his death in the 1970s. He never sought fame, never wrote memoirs. But the pilots who flew with him never forgot. The story of Freiwald is more than a tale of captured technology. It's about men caught in impossible circumstances, finding ways to survive and cooperate despite everything that should have kept them apart. It's about the strange bonds forged when survival depends on trust, even when trust seems impossible. The HE-162 never changed the outcome of World War II. By the time it flew, the war was already lost. But in the hands of men like Steiner and Park, it changed the future. It proved that even in the aftermath of total war, knowledge could bridge divides. It showed that progress sometimes requires setting aside hate at least long enough to learn from those who were once enemies. Looking back, it's easy to romanticize those weeks at Freiwald. The reality was harsher. Suspicion never fully disappeared. The weight of the war hung over every interaction. But what mattered most was that men chose to work together anyway. They chose to share knowledge, to take risks, to trust each other in moments when failure meant death. And maybe that's the real lesson. The future isn't built by those who cling to the past. It's built by those willing to move forward, even when the path is uncertain and the company is unexpected. Progress demands that we sometimes set aside who we were yesterday and focus on who we need to be tomorrow. So the next time you hear about jet fighters, about the technology that dominates modern skies, remember Freiwald. Remember Werner Steiner, who expected a bullet and got a chance to teach instead. Remember James Park, who trusted a former enemy with his life. Remember that sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields. They're won in cockpits, in hangars, in quiet moments when men choose cooperation over contempt. If this story resonated with you, if it gave you a glimpse of the complex humanity that exists even in war's darkest hours, make sure to subscribe. History is full of moments like these, hidden in the shadows, waiting to be told. And every one of them reminds us that we're capable of more than we think, even when the world tells us to hate. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.